So, like I said, I'm one of the ED docs, current research fellow in the department. I'm going to be talking to you about ECLS or Ecpr. I have no financial disclosures. If you're offering some, you can catch me afterward. So, with regard to Ecpr, we're going to talk about basically a high-level overview of what it is, talk a bit about the efficacy, both in terms of its clinically effective, cost-effective, who the population is we're aiming to do it for, and then sort of how it actually gets done. So let's start with what it is. So in a cardiac arrest, we're doing CPR, which is not very effective in terms of generating cardiac output. And so the idea is putting these patients and crashing them onto VA ECMO to produce that cardiac output instead of doing chest compressions. Now, that may sound kind of crazy or ultra heroic. And I guess to an extent it is, at least ultra heroic. But this is being done already in various parts of the world. In Paris, where they have a physician-led pre-hospital team, they do pre-hospital ECMO for cardiac arrest. You can see the Paris team putting an arrest patient on ECMO in the subway in Paris. And here's that team putting someone on ECMO in the Louvre. But closer to us, in the Minnesota Twin Cities area, they have recently started a pre-hospital ECMO program where they have a special ambulance that's set up with a C-arm and everything, so they can use it like a fluoro suite in order to put patients on ECMO intra-arrest. And also in New Mexico, they have created a specially modified ambulance for doing this. I think it's funny you see that in Minnesota, it has to be completely enclosed because they have winter, but in New Mexico, they'll just add a tent on the outside because the weather's usually better. But I think perhaps most impressively in the Netherlands, they now have nationwide coverage for putting a patient on ECPR during cardiac arrest, basically being able to get anywhere within the country and start to have that patient within 30 minutes of the initial arrest being reported to the emergency services. So the next question is, does it work? And I don't think I'd be here if the answer was no. But what's the state of the evidence? So I'm just looking at studies done in the last couple years because there's sort of been a large swell in this literature over the last few years. Most of them are retrospective or prospective cohort studies, which are showing anywhere between 14 to 30, 40% neurointact survival. But I want to highlight the two RCTs that were done within the last couple of years. The one that I think is probably most relevant is the Yiannopoulos 2020 study. This was in the Minnesota's Twin Cities area, where they had 43% neurointact survival versus 7% in the conventional group. And then the Prague study that was released this year, which showed 32% survival in the ECMO group and 22% in the conventional group. However, the Prague study showed no difference. That wasn't a statistically different outcome. And so how do we reconcile these two RCTs that were both well conducted, one showing tremendous results and one showing no difference? So the Yiannopoulos study had more stringent inclusion criteria, including the initial rhythm, witnessed arrest, et cetera. The Prague study was cardiac arrest, 18 to 65, all comers. Didn't matter initial rhythm, didn't matter if it was witnessed, didn't matter bystander CPR. So that's one, I think, important difference. And I think the other thing that I struggle with the Prague study is this 22% neurointact survival in their non-ECMO arm. Like, I don't know what that secret sauce is where they're getting such good outcomes there. But, looking through some of the tables, they have like 99% bystander CPR. It tends to be a younger cohort. So I think that I'm not sure that the takeaway from the Prague study is that there's no difference, but that with ECPR, we're still seeing that 30-ish% improve, 30-ish% in outcomes. I just am not sure how they got the control group to have such good outcomes, because I don't think 22% is typical of most places. Also, one other shortcoming of the Annapolis study, that was stopped early at a predetermined reevaluation. The Data Safety Monitoring Board said, look, your results at this point, it would be unethical to continue randomizing people to not receive ECMO. And when a study like this gets terminated early, it tends to overstate the effect size because of regression to the mean. So I think that what we are looking at when you look at all these studies and you look at the data from sort of the 5 large centers around the world, San Diego, Minneapolis, Paris, Melbourne, that are publishing on this, that we're looking at roughly a 35% neurointact survival rate at roughly 59 minutes of resuscitation. And I think we all know that for any patient after 59 minutes of CPR, their outcomes are pretty abysmal. And so to be able to have 35% neurointact survival in that group is a pretty sensational intervention. Now, that's great and all that it works, but is this cost effective? How can we justify doing this in people? Because it is a very expensive intervention. So first, we got to talk about quality adjusted life years, which is the currency of cost effectiveness research. And QALYs are an attempt to make an equation between having longer years with some disability versus shorter years with no disability. And so where there's one study that's kind of looked at the cost efficacy of ECPR, and they found that it was $51,000 about per QALY. Now, where does that lie in terms of other high or resource intensive interventions that we're doing? Well, dialysis is about $72,000 per QALY. A kidney transplant is $40,000 to $80,000 per QALY, and a heart transplant is a little under $100,000 per QALY. So yes, expensive, but also well within the range of other resource intensive things that we are doing for select patient populations. And speaking of that population, who are we doing this for? So there was a study this year where they used a Delphi method to get expert consensus on a bunch of things related to ECPR, and one of them was the inclusion criteria. And I think a lot of this is kind of the no-brainers. You want the best substrate so that you're doing this on someone who has the best probability of a good neuro outcome. And so they're saying age less than 75, witnessed arrest, initial shockable, on pump within 60 minutes of the arrest. And then, no prolonged downtime, didn't qualify that, but that's generally accepted to be less than 10 minutes. And then this is within the patient's wishes, et cetera. They're adding a little objective information here with end tidal cutoff. In Minneapolis, they actually use point of care lactate as part of their screening process. In the Netherlands, where they have that nationwide system for this, they actually have lowered the age cutoff to 50 years. And the way that they came to that actually had to do with system capacity. So they decided they were going to do this, roll this out to the whole country, and had the ability to put anyone on ECPR. And they looked at how many cardiac arrests are there. This is based off of their helicopter EMS, their air ambulances. So they said, how many additional flights could we do? How many additional ECMO runs could we do? And they had an idea of what the additional capacity in the system was to do this. And so they looked at their cardiac arrest data, and then they just dialed back the age until they found, until they had something that matched. So for them, 50 was what they could handle for the system. And so they used that to sort of create an objective cutoff. So how does this get implemented? What does this look like? Well, as always, it starts in the field with EMS. Now, because they're the first point of contact for these patients generally. Now, for a long time, we have not had much to offer cardiac arrest patients. And with the advent of EMS, they weren't doing a lot pre-hospital. The ambulance was a hearse, and there was nothing to do. Just get here, just get to the hospital. And we were the ones that had defibrillators and epinephrine and all the things that we could actually do something about. But starting around the time that I became a paramedic, 2010 or so, which was shortly after the 2005 AHA guidelines, the message had really changed to stay on scene. These are now trained professionals. They can do full ACLS, they can defibrillate, they can give epinephrine, they can give all these drugs, go through these, they can follow these algorithms. And we found that we had better outcomes by directing medics to stay on scene and to run the arrest on scene and wait until they got ROSC. And if they didn't ROSC, then either transport or terminate resuscitation. Additionally, we became aware that it was both unsafe and ineffective to do CPR in a moving ambulance. So in the modern era, we recognize that epinephrine doesn't work any better at the hospital. We had nothing extra to offer these patients unless we had very strong reason to believe that there was some reversible thing that we could do at the hospital that they couldn't do in the field, which in the vast majority of medical arrests just simply isn't the case. But now we are in the mechanical CPR, in the eCPR and ECMO era. So we have mechanical CPR devices where we're able to safely and effectively do CPR in transit. And my first reaction to these devices when they first came out was, well, that's dumb. Why are you doing CPR? Why are you transporting your cardiac arrest? You should be doing it on scene because we don't have anything at the hospital to offer. But now we do. So the messaging has changed. And now we have to rely on the EMS crews to be able to screen these patients for eligibility. So they can then decide, is this the patient where we're going to stay on scene and we're going to run this like a regular medical arrest? Or is this the patient that is potentially eligible for eCPR? And so we need to get them on the mechanical CPR device and we need to get to the hospital just as quickly as possible. And so the logistics of this actually happening, there's basically 3 steps. So step 1, we would do on every single cardiac arrest patient, and that's putting in a venous cordis and a femoral art line. And at this point, we have a hard cognitive stop and say, is this patient an ECMO candidate? If at this point they're not, there's no harm, no foul. You put 2 resuscitation lines in a resuscitation patient, no problem. If they are a candidate, then you're going to dilate, cannulate, heparinize, and then you're going to have another hard cognitive stop and decide, is this patient still an ECMO candidate? If they are not, then you stop. Still, we've cannulated, but it's still really no harm, no foul because we haven't initiated the expensive part, which is putting them on pump and sort of committing to ICU care afterward. If they are still an ECMO candidate, then we put the patient on pump and proceed with any other post-arrest treatments, getting them to the ICU, et cetera. So we're left with this question of, is it worth it? And I think it is, because this is an important component to getting the ball down the field to the next part of patient care. And I think we can take some lessons from trauma and how the trauma literature has played out over the last few decades. And so we had soldiers dying in the battlefield. And so we started using tourniquets, and then patients were not dying directly at the point of injury and in the battlefield and bleeding out. They were dying at the forward hospitals during surgery, immediately after surgery. And that's when we figured out that we needed to do damage control surgery. They just fix the big things. They sometimes leave the abdomen or whatever open and then ship the patient on to the next thing. So it's damage control resuscitation, damage control surgery. But then these patients were having these sort of really bad outcomes further down the road. And that's because we hadn't figured out the rehab and all of the other things that the patient needed for the long-term care, because those patients hadn't lived that long yet. And so I think that eCPR is the next step in moving that cohort of patients to the next thing, to be able to get them to that so that we can figure it out, so we can get them the good outcomes. And so I'll leave you with that I think that ECMO for cardiac arrest is not only effective, but it is cost effective, that we're beginning to understand who the right group of patients is for this. And that it certainly is very feasible. And it is being done not just in the hospital, but outside of the hospital, around the world, and even in the US now. Thank you.